All right. I
Okay,
think it's
we're
starting to
ready.
slow down. I think, Salo, you think we're good to go?
I think we're ready.
Okay.
All right.
Welcome, everyone.
Should we get started? Am I on, Eric?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So welcome, everybody. Today is the second day of the Alternative Migrant Trail Week here online. And just a big special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time today. We had our orientation session yesterday, and you can, if you missed it or if you miss any of these evening sessions, you can always feel free to check them out. We'll be sending the link to the recordings at the end of those kind of daily emails that you get. So you can check those out if you'd like to see those. Just so glad to see everyone's faces tonight. Really happy to be here. My name is Olivia Mena, and I'm a member of the organizing committee. I'm from Austin, Texas. And I think I always lose track. I think it's like my fourth or fifth year participating in the walk. And so I just was going to begin with a few sort of announcements, kind of housekeeping things, and then I'm going to introduce tonight's featured speaker. I want to begin just by thanking everyone for your patience with some of the kind of minor technical hiccups and broken links. Thank you if you emailed us and brought that to our attention. Many of us, you're not alone, many of us are learning how to navigate this kind of technology in this virtual environment. So it's new for a lot of people. So feel free if you have if you've kind of any problems or anything, just send us an email to the azmigranttrail@gmail.com. And there's a team of us kind of manning that email, checking that email daily. So we'll try to get you help as swiftly as possible. Everything that happens here in this week is a labor of love. And we're not an organization, but we're organizers. And so we all give of our time and talents to volunteer to put the pieces of this week together, both in the regular kind of walk week when we do it in person, but also in this virtual experience. And so that's one of the aspects that really is kind of very special about this. You know, by coming together through this collective action and in community, we make these really deep connections with one another. And it's incredibly fitting that one of our very first speakers for this week is a walker who has been a really key part in helping us build this intentional community of people who care so deeply about social justice, about living out their commitment in their actions and in their communities. And so I have the very special privilege and honor of introducing my colega and my colleague and friend, Lupe Castillo. Sorry, Roberto, I hope I wasn't talking too fast. I'll slow it down a little bit. I believe she's walked every year that we've done this walk. Is that right, Lupe? We've walked every single year?
With the exception of a couple of years, but I was there from the first one, helping in the driving.
Yes.
With the driving.
So Lupe has been a part of this walk since the very beginning. And when we walk together, it isn't uncommon at the end of a day's walk to see Lupe sitting in the shade with a bunch of people sort of sitting around her, listening and learning to the history of the borderlands. She gives these kind of wonderful in-person pláticas, charlas, these talks, and because she is a community historian and she's also an activist. And so Lupe is a retired history professor from Pima Community College in Tucson. She was also an activist in the Chicano civil rights movement. She was born and raised in Tucson. Yeah, she is a great history teacher, right? She was the co-founder of the University of Arizona's Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, MEChA. And in 1970, she helped to organize the Tucson residents to establish El Rio Neighborhood. And she fought to help build the Joaquin Murrieta Park on Tucson's west side. At Pima Community College, she was one of the very first professors to develop Chicana and Chicano studies courses. So we have this incredible opportunity and experience to sit with her and learn with her and learn from her decades of experience fighting as a fierce advocate for community and enabling positive change. And so she continues to do that work with organizations like Keep Tucson Together project and continues to support the Migrant Trail. So tonight, Lupe is going to invite us to see the Borderlands from the perspective of different communities, Indigenous people, Mexicans, Mexican-American communities, and really offer us ways of thinking and seeing and knowing what we call the Southwest United States, or some people call it Greater Northern Mexico, and expose kind of some of the enduring colonial ecologies that persist in border communities, while also broadening our capacity to imagine alternatives for those who have made the borderlands their home. So please join me in virtually welcoming Lupe Castillo.
Thank you very much, Olivia, and thank you everybody who is here this evening for joining with us. And what I offer today is perhaps some reflections on my experience as a lifetime of living in this region. I am as rooted as any mesquite tree. I have never been able to unroot myself from the desert and to leave. So I bring that sense of perspective, and I thank you for joining with us tonight. I would like to begin by asking ourselves, what is this space that we call the borderlands in which we who are native to this area live in? You know, this borderland ranges from California all the way to Texas, and it's probably just under 2,000 miles. A boundary, a border, and we have to be very clear, imposed by invasion, by conquest, by war, by violence, and that violence persists to this day. Accompanied by very profound resistance from the very beginning. As you know, the US national narrative of our nation state, and all nation states have their official narrative. Our narrative ranges in a sense of movement from the east to the west. That it was in the creation of this narrative, that it was a narrative supposedly that was made freely, personal, you know, foundational to the US character, this sense of free movement. And that movement moving westward situated this region, this area and its people to a location that was called the West, the Southwest, the Sun Belt, and so forth, and remained, importantly, outside of the national narrative of free movement. We were not free to move, those of us who were native to this region. So for those of us who are native to this region, we see ourselves as we are. And for those of us who live in this region, we live in what we sense in ourselves as the North, El Norte. So for us, our history, our culture, our narrative is a North-South sense. This does not make this narrative better than the East-West narrative. It's a different narrative, but it's intersectional. And this is what makes this very complex, because on this layer are a complexity of other narratives that that lay one on top of the other, as one anthropologist called it, the cycles of conquest. Okay, and so that's what we're kind of looking at. But when I talk about North and South, I see also from time immemorial into mythic time that we have this sense. For example, the idea of a place of Aztlán and the great journey that was made from Aztlán to the south, to the lake areas, where the gods prophesied, there you will find a lake. On the lake will be a nopal, an eagle, and a serpent will be in the beak of this eagle. This was the great city of Tenochtitlan. It's founding Mexico. And so that is as great a journey story as any that are creator stories throughout the planet of all people. There is no question that the most profound space in this region is indigenous. And it isn't one people, but many peoples that are in their own time, in their own place in this area. We have to completely understand that before we even talk about a border. Let me just give a simple example. Here in the state of Arizona, for example, as we sit here reflecting, there are over 20 languages native to this area that are being spoken outside of English and Spanish. And it is spoken by people in their own place, in their own time, in their way of life. And they are not simply surviving, but creating future within their own time. And this is what I call the big resistance, the presence. And even in face of enormous oppressive conditions over a long time, we can date it back over 500 years. And like today, for example, we see the enormous conditions under which the Dene, the Navajo people are living with the COVID virus. Now, that is the very most important piece. Over there, over the indigenous, then comes another very profound layer that is led by, the Spanish Empire. Okay, and this is important to understand because the Spanish Empire invading, conquering, establishing a colonial cultural control lasted over 300 years. As far as San Francisco, all the way to the tip of South America and into the Caribbean. It's important, 300 years. Think about it, the United States as a nation state is less than that. So the impact is still alive with us. And for those of you who have traveled into Mexico, Central America, South America, you know that it is still, that weight of that history is still very heavy on the communities there. And that those communities are still in resistance 500 years. Over the presence of the Spanish Empire, let us not forget that the Spanish Empire that invaded these regions was the most powerful and the first modern empire of Europe. And it was a global empire as powerful as how we see the United States today. I mean, it ranged all the way from Sevilla all the way to the Philippines, and controlled enormous wealth that was all pooled into Europe and that went to pay the bankers of Germany, the bankers of Italy, the bankers of England, and I would suggest lay the foundation for the capital accumulation that leads to the Industrial Revolution on the backs of those natural resources that were pooled into Europe. Following that, we have the fight for the creation of a nation state of Mexico. And the nation state of Mexico obviously inherited the territorial extension of the Spanish Empire. With the United States momentum to the West, in the momentum that was called manifest destiny, of a sacred movement that was decreed by God to a chosen people, and that was moving westward, clashed with the presence of others. And I think here we should point out that in that national narrative, the control of movement was already in place in the United States with slavery and the slave state that was internal to, in quotes, the liberal free state, and also with the control of indigenous communities and the movements of borders from the Appalachians to the Mississippi, and as they move, so that the United States in manifest destiny movement dragged behind it, you might say, various borders and move them as needed. And so war broke out between the United States and Mexico, and the United States invaded Mexico through California, through New Mexico, through northern Mexico itself, and the largest force went from New Orleans to Veracruz, following the route of Cortés into Mexico City. Mexico was conquered by the United States, as we hear in the hymn of the Marines from the shore, from the halls of Moctezuma. Why did the United States not maintain Mexico? Because they understood that it would be a very prolonged war. Mexico was expert in wars, in what we call today guerrilla wars. And so the United States signed a treaty with Mexico that turned all of the northern Mexico to the United States. 50% of Mexico was turned over to the United States, and the border was established and has remained with a few variations. One, the Gadsden Purchase in the area in which I live, that was turned over to the United States in the 1854. Now, important to understand is the treaty supposedly guaranteed to those people remaining in these territories, estimated somewhere around 200,000 Mexican citizens, another 200,000 of indigenous communities outside of that citizenship, that there were certain guarantees to be made to these communities. However, very quickly was established controls over these communities, some by law and some by extra legal means, by social control, vigilantism, by social practice, by imposing Jim Crow presence in these areas. so that the region was racialized and was placed under controls. You might say that the indigenous community were rounded up and put in open air detention centers, if you will, the reservations. And the indigenous communities were pushed where the United States wanted them to go. And the Mexicanos were also pushed into areas living in very segregated conditions, and that there were forces like the Texas Rangers, which were forces that were used by the state for control not only of indigenous communities, but also Mexicanos and also for Blacks as well. So these conditions, and we see, for example, in the 19th century, we began to see the Immigration Exclusion Acts of the Chinese, because they become too other for the presence that they have in California. In all of this, there was a great deal of resistance, and we don't have time to go into all of the forms of resistance, but they range all the way from violence to filing lawsuits in courts and so forth. So the more oppression, the more oppressive conditions, the more resistance, and resistance come in different forms. And so we have to look at the different forms that were used in resisting, whether it was mutual societies or whether it was armed struggle as well. Now, the border as was imposed remains basically open throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. As capital investment came into the greater West, this was enormous investments, not only by private industries, but more importantly, by the government. Because there's this kind of fantasy and myth that we have that the West was, in its moving frontier ethos, was individualistic, independent, but in fact, it was the government that put tons of money into the building of railroads and other infrastructure of roads, new towns, and this brought about the need for enormous workers, construction, and then the industrialization of mining as a, that was able to be carried out because of railroad bringing in machinery, industrialization of the cattle industry. And then you have the blooming of agriculture in desert areas as a result of the damming of the rivers, principally the Colorado, and therefore opening desert areas of cheap water to the LA, Los Angeles Basin, the Imperial Valley, the Maricopa areas, and so forth. And this brought about also the need for workers. And then you have the rise of the tourist industry to see, you might say, the creation of what the tourist industry wanted to see. So you have Spanish days, you have Indian days, rodeos, and so forth, that creates the tourist industry. All of this demands a lot of workers, very intensive need for workers. And so workers are brought in from the South. And so what develops then is the need for workers coming in. There was no fear of that, because when they came in, and I say came in because they were outside, when they came in, they were living in segregated communities, segregated schools, a criminalization of a system as well, so that there was already controls in place. And when the industries collapse, as happened during the First World War with the cotton industry, then literally workers would be just pushed back into Mexico. You did not need like formal deportation orders, you just like push people into Mexico. So when the immigration reforms began to occur in the United States, and we can't go into a lot of the details of how immigration becomes, but you often hear people saying, you should come in the way my parents did. You know, they came in legally. Well, there was no such thing. The United States, simply, you just bought a ticket, came in, met a few regulations, and I use the words, you were not an idiot, you were not diseased, etc., and then you could come in. But by 1917, there begins to form the idea that we should control our borders. And between 1917 and 1924, there was a great immigration reform, which was based on race. That the original sender countries would now be favored, and that it was based on eugenics, in other words, white supremacy. And that the people that at that time were to be excluded were Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, basically meaning Italians and Russian Jews. Now, interestingly, Mexicanos and people from the South and the Caribbean were not excluded because workers were needed. And so also at this time, the Border Patrol is established. And as all of you know, the first agents that were brought in really were actually chasing the Chinese who had come to Mexico and coming up the border. But what is important to understand is they came from the Texas Rangers. And I still submit that to this day, the culture of the Texas Ranger is deeply rooted in the Border Patrol. No matter who comes into the Border Patrol, whether they are Chicanos, Blacks, or other minorities, they are taught that culture, and that is their behavior. Now, on the wall itself, and we have to kind of ask ourselves, why is it that the militarization and the intensification of militarization began in the midst of NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreements? If we were going to open all borders, why was it that that's when the Border Patrol began to be increased beginning in 1994 and going all the way to the present, going from a few thousand to what is over 20,000 Border Patrol now? The border, we can explain at this time, is that there was going to be this enormous change in which you have the neoliberal consensus that is coming forth, in which free trade means free movement of capital, free movement of goods and commodities, but you are going to control workers and the movement of workers. And that militarization was then, we began to see the end of what we would call the welfare state or the New Deal state, that freedom and freedom of movement is now going to be codified for the few, as civil rights that had been fought for in the 60s and 70s and before that began to be eroded, so that the nation state begins to serve as the security agent, the protector for what becomes global capitalism and capitalists, the 1%, to move freely in its ferocious accumulation of wealth at the expense of workers. So that literally factories could be picked up from one nation state and taken to another to prevent unionizing and so forth. So that places like Mexico to this day must still negotiate to survive, and to survive for whom? For its elites, obviously not for its people. So this then is where we are in terms of the enormous shadow that this wall casts, and all walls everywhere. That the wall we are focused on is a place, but utter indifference to the devastation and the enormous violence that is committed not only against human, but also flora and fauna, to the very face that is so sacred. Yesterday, when Kat Rodriguez did her presentation, she had this marvelous map that, as you saw, at the end was a bloody river of blood in the desert. And that is the violence of that wall. And a wall that expands to the interior. It is reflected in the detention centers right now, where people are dying because of the virus, where people are being released and deported with a virus to infect their communities, to infect our communities here within their families and so forth. So the shadow of the wall is not just the place where it is being built, but certainly it casts that violence everywhere as well. So to conclude, I would like to say, in all of this, what is the role that we see migrants and people in movement, not only in this area, but all over the world. People in movement, I would suggest, are the revolutionaries of the 21st century. It is they who are walking through the walls, facing jails, facing torture, facing more than hardship, enormous violence. They face death day in and day out, but they will not be stopped. And so we who are on the migrant trail and all of us working in our communities, we must stand with them. And we must not only stand with them, but walk with them through walls as well. Thank you very much. And if you have questions or want to make comments, I've invited Olivia to say a few words, because she indeed is at the forefront of analyzing much of this, what is going on throughout the world in movement.
Well, thank you, Lupe, so much for such a moving and powerful and rich history, and condensing just years and years and years of study into a succinct and precinct lecture that we can access and understand, and really get a sense of that kind of entirety of the colonial and imperial sort of histories and residues that kind of sit and inform our experiences. I've prepared just sort of a short response, and I'll sort of say that, and that'll give folks time to maybe kind of think about their questions. But I would echo Lupe in the importance of thinking about and researching the history of the border and the border wall, and thinking about migrants and people who move as the revolutionaries of our time. And Lupe is exactly right, because we live in an age of unprecedented migration. There has never been this much sort of human movement and displaced peoples around the world. That being said, migration is something that we've historically done forever. And what I love about Lupe's history is that it situates the long history of the border, that for 3,000 years, thousands of years, people have always moved from what we call south to north, right? And north to south. Those movements have, those corridors and movements are normal and natural. And it's only fairly the kind of recent historical histories, and I use recent in the last, several hundred years, that these recent histories are what have initiated the intense closures of the border, stopping people. And I think what Lupe's history does and what it gives us is it really helps us to think about where we're at today, this place where we conceive of the national border as a wall, as an unending 2,000-mile wall from sea to shining sea, right? And how in many ways the US has become a sort of standard bearer for this kind of nationalism, so that, understanding your border as a wall sort of reproduces and creates a kind of monument to the sort of racial histories that inform that wall. And Lupe is exactly right about the Texas. I live in Texas. There's an author, Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who has a wonderful book about the history of the Border Patrol. If you want to learn more about that, it's called Migrant. But the Texas Rangers were the very first paramilitary organization in our country, and we're sort of the prototype and model of our contemporary border patrol. And in sort of that militarizing and closure of the border that has sort of intensified in the context of sort of the free movement of capital, but the restrictions on movement for people, the US's role in that has really sort of authorized the kind of global border walls. And so we live in a world of walls. We live in a world of unprecedented migration and movement, but also a world that is now full of walls. And there are more than 57 new border walls and fences that have been built by countries around the world since 2001. So this is a history that's important in our border, and our border has an important sort of planetary kind of conversation that's happening too. And I'll just conclude by saying that Lupe's very powerful intervention gives us something else that's such a powerful resource, which is thinking about the long horizon of struggle and resistance. And I really loved what you said about kind of Indigenous communities and situating these long histories of Indigenous struggle as part of our contemporary histories of struggle against these formations too. We often think of those as past, and they're not past, they're present. And I think by tapping into those histories, and what's so important about the histories that Lupe has worked on for her whole career and helped taught so many of us, is that it orients us towards this really powerful future looking space where we have a horizon for change. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate your talk tonight. Do we need to change formats, Eric, to do
Yeah, so thank you both, Lupe and Olivia, for that. That was incredible. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 5-minute break. Feel free to go get a snack, grab a drink of your choice, and we'll come back, and we're going to make everybody an attendee. So we're going to move everybody back to attendee, and then we can use the Q&A function, and you'll be able to ask questions of either of our panelists tonight. So feel free, go take whatever break you need, and we'll be back here at 6:19 and 14 seconds. Or
unless you're in a different time zone.
Oh, sorry. 19 minutes after the hour, whatever time zone you're in. That's what I meant to say. So Sorry, Olivia, we kind of got overzealous with moving people over. So, so I'm going to unmute you again. And I'm going to unmute Lupe as well. So if you want to click OK, you should be able to unmute yourselves. All right, great.
Okay.
So we'll start back up in a minute. And I realized what I forgot to do is ask everybody to give you guys a round of applause. So, but you all did, because that was really, really awesome. So, I don't know if this will work.
Are we in a
All right, everybody,
oh.
give him a round of applause. Your mics are unmuted. Yay! Okay, can't hear it. Never mind. I tried. All right. Sorry, I just muted you guys again, because I had to mute everybody. So I just unmuted you. So, so we're gonna come back together. Hopefully everybody is back, because obviously I can't see your cams now, so I don't know if you are back. But we'll go ahead and begin the Q&A. And I believe Olivia, you're gonna manage that, right?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and kind of read the questions for Lupe, and we can sort of start with a conversation. I guess I'll give you the first opportunity as people are kind of starting to fill in their questions in the Q&A bar. Maybe I'll give Lupe a little moment to respond first, and then I'll start reading the questions.
Perfect.
Can you unmute Lupe, please?
I did, and then I had to mute them again. So you should be able to unmute again, Lupe. Try it again. We had it set, and then I messed it up because I was trying to let everybody give them applause. Oh, they're not able to unmute. Okay, press, okay, I'm gonna do it one more time. I'm gonna click unmute, Lupe, and then you guys should be able to unmute your mic. In the lower left usually is a little icon that looks like a old school microphone with a red line through it, probably. Just like before. Is it not working? We can't hear you yet. Uh-oh.
There we
Okay.
go. All right.
There we go. Okay.
Oh.
Sorry about that. That was my fault. My fault. Sorry.
That's all right.
Don't be making us climb mountains.
Hyperventilate.
I won't do that again, I promise.
So are you ready for us to start again, Eric? Or
Yeah, go right ahead.
okay. So yeah, so I'll open up, and Lupe, everyone's there. We can't see them right now in this setting, but I'll read you the questions. But go ahead, and I'll give you a chance to respond if you'd like, and then I'll read a couple questions.
Real quick tutorial for those of you who don't realize what we're doing. So on the bottom of your screens, you should, along that bar, there should be a menu down there somewhere, and it says Q&A, and it looks like two little chat boxes. You can click on that and see, and you can enter in questions, and then they go to Olivia, and then Olivia and Lupe can answer them. So feel free to put in your questions in there.
So the first question we have is, no one has mentioned the role of population explosion throughout the world as a cause of migration and wall building. How can we sustain a more open society with the numbers of people searching for jobs, food, and space to live in as we go forward? It's Carolyn's question.
Well, I don't know how much, population has to do with it, but more how, what conditions and factors fall on populations. And so I think that we need to look, for example, we can look at Mexico, and we can see that its population has plummeted. And so it's really not an issue, I think, although not everywhere, but in some of these instances, a population, but of the resources and how they are distributed. Maybe Olivia has some other perspective.
I would just add to that I think kind of some of the kind of global climate crisis
Yes.
that's happening is really related to some of the ways that Lupe is talking about, actually the trajectories of these commodities and capitalism, and the way that those have shaped kind of our social, political, national environments, and kind of where we invest sort of our resources in, and how resources get sort of, like she said, in the colonial period, they were pooled in Europe. Now they're being pooled in the kind of the 1%, and the ways in which that kind of creates, some people have called it disaster capitalism and things like that. People have given it sort of different names, but ultimately a lot of that has to do with kind of the unequal structures of distributing resources or expending resources in ways that aren't sustainable and really adversely affect sort of certain historically oppressed communities usually. Let's go to the next one. Let me ask another one. Here's an interesting question. Are the 20 indigenous languages in Arizona thriving, struggling, or in danger of dying?
I think they're thriving, and because we see the young people coming forth and really supporting, and we see it not just here in Arizona, but across the United States and in Mexico and Central America, that now you see flourishing poets, artists, and others who are writing in their own languages. And I think that becomes very, very important. So I would say thriving. Obviously, in some communities where there are very few people, it's a major struggle. But in general, I would say thriving. And that's one of the reasons where there's so much blowback.
Entonces todos estos idiomas indígenas están más que vivos. Incluso lo vemos por muchas autores y poetas de comunidades indígenas ahora escriben no en español, en inglés, sino en sus propios idiomas.
We're kind of from this region for forever, it seems, both from indigenous and mestizo communities. I'm sure there's like a little bit of the Españoles and whoever else has come through, and we're part of that. But we have survived and are part of this desert since forever. Some of my ancestors are buried here in the cemetery, and one of them was born before when this was still part of the Spanish Empire. So we're part of this area, and maybe that's why I'm so rooted here, like the Mesquite.
I have another historical question. What was the relationship or interaction between the Mexicanos and indigenous peoples? How did that change with the coming of the whites?
Well, in different places it was different. There's in many instances, and this has been documented, that people could kind of move from indigenous world to kind of you might say Mexicano life in communities. So in some instances the relationships were good, in other instances not so good, right? And my grandmother used to say to me, your grandfather, they lived out on a ranch here in southern Arizona, and he said he never had any problems with the Apache, because he did what people in the desert do, which is if people want water, you give them water, because that's what you do in the desert. You give them food, and then people move on. But they will not go with certain families because they are, they kind of are against the Apache. So in some instances, you have those relationships that were good, and in some instances not. Now, the Mexican state, the Mexican nation, set out to rid itself of the Yaqui, for example, and began a genocide against them. And the Yaqui are still here. You know, they fought that genocide. And so there was different moments in history where those relationships
Diferentes momentos en la historia
with the Mexicanos, but with
en
the state itself, and some of the wealthy elites that wanted those lands and those waters.
Yeah, I know in Texas, some of the kind of gendered experiences of that were a lot about intermarrying. So like rich Mexicano families would try to marry white families to sort of preserve titles or lands. And so there's all these kind of gender dimensions to some of those histories. Lupe, thank you for the superb presentation. This is from Eileen. My question might be jumping too far ahead in our week. How did we get from being a congenial border crossers 100 years ago to felon in per chains or sent to prison? Thanks.
Could
So
you
kind of,
repeat?
sure. Like, so it's a question asking kind of to talk a little bit about that period. How did we go from when the border was largely open, you could cross without sort of papers, to now where it's like impossible, it's closed, literally closed today.
With just like maybe 25 years ago, I had students from Bisbee, and one of them told me a story that they were on the track team, and during lunch they would do their running, and they would run to have lunch in Naco, Sonora, and then they would run back through the desert and come back into Bisbee. But now, she said, we can't do that. They don't let us, that we have to go through the ports. When I was growing up, for example, when there were national holidays in Nogales, Sonora, the border would stay open and people would go back and forth. The image that has grown was like that people, if the border is open, people will storm to the border to get in. And so over time, because of the conditions that I have mentioned and that become very complex, this has changed to the point where today it is easy for Americans to travel into Mexico, but it is very hard for Mexicanos to come into the United States unless they're very wealthy and are able to come in. So, so how this has changed over time, many of us have seen and experienced it, and certainly we have seen that militarization began to really establish itself in the 1990s, it's beginning 1994 and so forth. But we also should not be nostalgic, because there has always been violence at the border and control of populations coming back and forth. So we have to be very careful saying at one point we could do this or that. What we have to look at more than anything is some of the changes, why some of these changes have come about, and where we have to go from that.
There's another historical question in the queue. Lupe, what can the history tell us about the lessons of imperialist regimes like Rome, Britain, Russia, China, and the impact or ineffectiveness of walls like Hadrian's Wall, the Great Wall of China, the Berlin Wall, and our border wall, among others?
Well, certainly there have always been walls, and and I kind of remember working with a young man during the sanctuary years in the 1980s, and I was lending him the phone to call his mom, and he said, I am now inside, you know, and that always has remained with me, that if you are inside, that means everything else is outside. And so walls have been part of empires and of countries. I think Olivia was talking about something extraordinary. There are 57 walls being built or have been built throughout the world today because people are in movement. And certainly we all know that walls are meant often to kill, as we see with the Palestinians. And so I think that we can look historically at walls, and we have also seen that walls ultimately end up dead things, like the China wall that is meaningless now. That how can you not go over walls with a new technology, for example? There is nothing that you can hide from. With the infrastructure of technology and all the other means of penetrating into people's world, the walls are like props for politicians to stand in front of. As all our politicians go and stand in front of the Nogales wall or Douglas or somewhere and pronounce how terrorism is being stopped. You know, 9/11 occurred and there was walls, you know, and so the idea of those walls, I think we can look at historically, and we will see that what they were used for.
Okay, I have one more question in the queue. If anyone else wants to add any more, we still have a little time left. The last question is from David. Even though no one in power expected the coronavirus pandemic, do you see continuities between US immigration policy and the federal response to COVID-19 in terms of like controlling workers? And I'm going to add to your question, David, like the border maybe.
Yes. Well, yes, we see, for example, by the way, historically, disease has been used. When we look at history and how disease has been used at different times for control as well. Like today, for example, the detention camps and centers are filled with people who have, some who have died, but they don't say they died in the detention center because they take them out, they go to the hospitals, they die in the hospital. They release people with disease to Guatemala, to Mexico, to any of the countries in Central America, Guatemala, and so forth, right? So, and here, even among our communities, where the greatest impact has been in communities, people of color. So that, does this matter? It does, because we see how racialized our health system is and how racism is still so deeply rooted, you know, that it kind of hits us frontally, but we have to make sure that that people see it for what it is and not hide it.
Okay, well, we have a couple minutes left. If there's any last questions, we can get them in. I don't know if you have any final kind of concluding things you'd like to say, Lupe. If not. There's no more questions in the queue. All right.
Well, I certainly want to thank everybody for your questions and your comments, and for being part of this very powerful and wonderful experience that we all share in this community that we have formed over many years, and that all of you have joined with us tonight. And thank you for kindly listening to some of my comments, and we'll continue this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lupe. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. The Q&A is filling up with thank yous from all kinds of participants. I'm just saying thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for sharing your beauty and your wisdom. Thank you. What a great gift of knowledge, Lupe. Thank you, Lupe. So I echo all the choruses of thank yous. I've learned so much from you, and ever since I've met you on the walk, and I really appreciate this conversation we've had tonight. I want to do a short plug about tomorrow's webinar, which will be very connected to some of the themes and discussions we're having today. So we kind of can continue thinking about these issues. Tomorrow's webinar will feature Nellie Jo David and her talk called O'odham Roots Run Deeper Than Walls. The Tohono O'odham Nation was first cut in half by the creation of the US border, and in the last several decades has been cut in half by the US border wall. And the Tohono O'odham Nation is currently occupied, an occupied nation filled with Border Patrol agents in their homeland. It's been turned into a graveyard for border crossers. And so Nellie Jo David is a co-founder of the O'odham Anti-Border Collective, a grassroots organization that really works to maintain connections, strengthen Indigenous rights, and autonomy in the face of the ongoing impact of colonialism, imperialism, and the militarization of their traditional lands. So that's tomorrow's session. So be sure to tune in for that. Also, just wanted to remind everybody, usually in the walk, we're together, we're taking pictures with each other and giving each other hugs. We have this kind of community. And so it's hard to kind of replicate that in a virtual environment. So we're encouraging everyone as the week goes on, if you have sort of poems or reflections or things you'd like to share with the group or photos of you on your walk, please feel free to share those. And we have like a Google form that you can submit it to. You could put it to their Facebook page or Twitter, Instagram. It doesn't have to be long if you don't have the bandwidth to write something long, but we'd love to kind of hear about how your experience is going. And at the end of the week, one of our committee members, Samantha Shipman's putting together kind of a slideshow to kind of document our week. So she's kind of collecting that. So we'd love to hear from you. And so please feel free to share that. Eric, I think we've ended just perfectly on time, a couple minutes early. So
yay, good job. Thank you, Lupe and Olivia, and for everybody being here. Know that you can also leave comments